All right, now we're in my wheelhouse. We're going to be talking today about archaeology and biological anthropology, or physical anthropology. As I've stated before, I'm an archaeologist primarily. I dig in the dirt, and I find evidence for human activities from the past, and I interpret it. Some of the things that I find as I'm excavating, as I dig, as I survey, are human remains as well. And so biological anthropology is part of archaeology as well. So we're going to talk about both of these together. It's partly because the book lumps them together. But I've spoken a little bit about archaeology and biological anthropology before. I want to say a little bit more about it today. But frankly, I could talk your ear off. And it would require a whole class for me, well, many classes for me to go into as much depth as I would like to about these subjects. So what I'm going to limit myself to are some of the basic concepts about archaeology and biological anthropology that are going to help us in this course. Because in the forthcoming chapters, there's going to be several chapters that are going to look at the human past. I've mentioned this before, that part of understanding what a human is, part of anthropology, is looking for some of the reasons why we are what we are today. And the only way to do that is to look into the past. So biological anthropology needs raw information to be able to study. And so how do you get that? Well, an archaeologist finds it. So the methods of archaeological investigation are things that we need to understand so you can understand what the data that we're going to be looking at when we come to human evolution and cultural evolution from the past. When we come to those, you need to know how we know this. How do archaeologists get this information, and how do biological anthropologists understand that information when it comes to the human body? Well, first of all, archaeology is as broad as the entire discipline of anthropology is broad. Even though it's a sub-discipline of anthropology, it's essentially trying to understand life, human life in the past. So where cultural anthropology is looking at primarily contemporary cultures, understanding living human communities, archaeology is doing a similar thing but for the past. The problem is you can't go back in time to interview people, so you need to have some kind of data to work with. And you can't interview people, especially in prehistory, and you can't necessarily trust what they wrote. What you can trust, however, is the physical remains from the past. Now, the problem with that is that it's partial. It's a piecemeal record. It's not perfect. So it requires a lot of buildup of information, big data sets, big lots of evidence. And the evidence is not always complete. The way I liken it to is like a multi-million piece puzzle that doesn't have all the pieces, and you don't know what the picture's supposed to look like. So it's hard. It's painstaking, it's slow, and it constantly has to be updated with more and more information. But just like a puzzle, if you step back a bit, you sort of squint your eyes, you can say, okay, I can see a pattern there starting to emerge. That's really what archaeology is trying to do with the past, is to build up enough evidence that we might be able to see, however dimly, what life might have been like in the past for humans. That can then tell us about some of the origins of the way we behave today. Now, if you go back far enough in time, we are talking about a couple of different Greek words. Archaeo means old in Greek. Paleo means even older in Greek. So they both mean old, but paleo sort of means like forgotten about, way, way, way old. So a paleontologist or a paleoanthropologist is someone who studies, a paleontologist is someone who studies the deep past. A paleoanthropologist is about human origins, sometimes even before humans were humans, before we were the species that we call Homo sapiens today. What the cutoff between a paleoanthropologist and an archaeologist is a sort of a nebulous area. And I tend to work in more recent cultures, the past 10,000 years or so I call myself exclusively an archaeologist. But if you were to go back 20,000 years, you might very well call yourself and 2 million years ago, you might very well call yourself a paleoanthropologist or paleontologist. And depending on how far back you go, you might be dealing with different materials. So I deal with the remains of buildings, tools. We get burned food remains and things like that, whereas someone who's working with remains from 2 million years ago would be really hard-pressed to find things like that. They're extremely rare. So you go back far enough in time, even bones don't survive. And you should know this already. I mean, when you think about when someone, if an animal or even a human dies, what happens? They decay. They disintegrate. They turn into nothing. But in very rare circumstances, which we'll discuss later on, in very rare circumstances, a fossilization process takes place. And fossils are actually not really bones. They're the impressions of bones. They're the casts of bones. They're the mineralized former bones that have turned into stone. And which means they don't, if it's old enough, if it's 2 million years old, it's going to be a fossil or nothing. And fossils won't have DNA, for instance. So there's a limit of what we can do, and the further back in time you go, the more partial and piecemeal the data becomes. And the closer in time you get, the more information you have to deal with. But ultimately, and this is going to be important for when we start discussing evolution, it's not enough to just get an artifact or a bone. What you want to do is build up what's called an assemblage. And that is the entirety of a picture of everything that's going on with that community or group of people or natural environment that is taking place at that moment in time. So how hot is it? How dry is it? How wet is it? What are the resources available? Is there food available? Is there water available? Is it steep? Is it flat? So topography, environment, ecology, in addition to the stuff that goes in there, your house, your fire, your tools, all of these things build up a picture of the lifestyle from the past, whether that was our pre-human ancestors or a civilization for more recent years. And so the way to understand this requires us to understand how decay has happened. There's a word that I want you to remember. It's called taphonomy. 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 It comes from the Greek word taphos, which means grave, but forget about grave. What it means is taphonomy is the understanding or the science of the way that time and nature affects the survival of things from the past. So the decay of bones, to understand why they've decayed in this way, would be taphonomy. You'd understand taphonomy. Why does wood not survive? Taphonomy will tell you why it doesn't. If it does survive, taphonomy will also tell you that, right? So understanding the processes that go into destroying and disintegrating the evidence from the past helps you to fill in the gaps. So you've got that big puzzle and you've got little pieces scattered all around, but if you know that, wait a minute, wood doesn't survive in this environment after 5,000 years, so I'm not going to find it. But there must have been wood, so let's write that in. Here's a big part of that puzzle that we can think, okay, they probably would have had wood or basketry or other organic materials, leather, that just doesn't survive. So taphonomy helps us not only to understand what we find, but also what we don't find, to fill in the gaps, to build up a picture of the past that is holistic again. Once you have that, then you've got to interpret it. So data is just data. Are just data. They don't speak for themselves. So what an archaeologist needs to do is employ anthropological concepts to understand human behavior from the past based on the evidence that we find in the present. So what do archaeologists do? Well, first of all, you need to find out where the archaeology is, and it's all over the place. As I mentioned in a previous lecture, archaeology is not a time or a place. It's not just ancient Greece or Egypt. It is yesterday. It can be. I mentioned the Garbology project, which employs archaeological techniques on contemporary society. So looking at a society from an artifactual perspective and from a material culture perspective is really the archaeological method. And it can be from something that's 5 minutes ago or 5 million years ago. It doesn't matter. So depending on what you're interested in looking at, archaeologists try to find where that is. And if that's a cowboy camp from the 19-teens, or a Paleo-Indian site from 9,000 years ago, is not really the question. You need to find where it is, and then you apply your anthropological understanding to try and interpret those remains. So the first step in archaeology is to find the sites, and this is done through what's called survey. And surveys can be both extensive, which means you cover a large land area. You try and find you just pinpoint dots on a map. Here's a site, here's a site, here's a site, here's a site. Then once you find those sites, you can maybe get a little bit more evidence by doing an intensive survey, collecting as much data as you can from the surface. Now, why would archaeology be on the surface? Well, because taphonomy, once again, erosion erodes things away or transports it elsewhere. Goats walking across a surface are going to kick up dust and dirt and pull things up to the surface. Trees are going to have roots that go down into the ground. The tree falls over and brings things up to the surface. Things that are buried, long buried under the ground, can find their way up to the surface. And for us to find. Sometimes they remain buried and they're invisible to us in survey. We do the best that we can. And surveys just cover territory and they observe what is on the surface of the ground, giving us an impression of what might lie beneath. There are so many archaeological sites, because like I said, this is all human activity from all time. Archaeology is not just about the very, very ancient past. It's about all periods. And we talked in the last lecture about applied anthropology and cultural resource management. Cultural resource management that is doing a survey for electrical lines that are going down across from the north of Nevada to the south of Nevada. They don't choose what they're going to find. They're employed to survey where those power lines are going in. They record what they find, and that can be something from the 1930s. It can be from something from 200 years ago. It can be something from 2,000 years ago. It can be anything, right? So you don't get to choose as a cultural resource management professional. But some people do get to choose. Some people have research questions about certain types of things. And the key point is that nobody excavates a site without a very specific reason. There's too much to dig. There's just way too many sites out there. You need to have, and also it's taphonomy is sort of a slow process. That once you excavate something, you're destroying it in the process. You're disassembling the taphonomic system that has gone to bury this. It's probably better off leaving it there until you have a reason to excavate it. By excavating, you are destroying. And I guess this is as good of a place as any to point out that, contrary to popular culture, archaeologists are not treasure hunters. Professional archaeologists keep a big fat zero of the artifacts that they find. Nothing. I as a professional archaeologist, I own no artifacts. I've never bought or sold an artifact. I don't even know what they would be worth, because I don't deal in trafficking of antiquities. That is illegal. And what I do is, under permission, with governmental permission in this country and in other countries, I operate under license on behalf of an authority to investigate things, either for a research purpose or for salvage in case it's threatened and it's going to be destroyed by something, development or erosion or something like that. And then I analyze it and I publish those remains. Now, this is the social contract that I have. The ethics of what I do is that by destroying through excavation, I am replacing what I have taken away with a permanent record in publication. That's what sets me apart from a looter or a vandal. Also, all of the things that I find in an excavation go to a museum or the authority that gave me permission to dig there. And that's why I don't own any of this stuff. It all goes into a museum for permanent storage, or the authority tells me what I should do with that. Often reburying or something like that. So it is not by any means treasure hunting, and I do not encourage you to go out and do your own excavations, because you're destroying it when you do that. So be very respectful. Also, archaeology may be of ancient people, but it's also often local inhabitants where the archaeology is taking place feel a connection to that past. It could actually be their ancestors. And so by destroying the past, you can actually be destroying the heritage of a group of people that still exists and lives. That can be, in fact, that is considered a human right. And there are plenty of international treaties that recognize heritage management and destruction of cultural property as a human rights violation. So the other thing about excavation is it's not just digging holes in the dirt rapidly and trying to find stuff. Once again, this isn't treasure hunting. It's a systematic removal and systematic deconstruction of the taphonomic processes that led to the present day, going back in time to see how this came to be, and also collecting everything along the way. Now, there's a principle here that you need to understand, which is what's called the principle or the law of superpositioning, or superposition. And all that really is a layer cake methodology, right? So the stuff, if you come to a site and you're standing right here, that surface is modern, right? And everything below that, if you dig down 1 meter below the surface, you're going back in time, because this has to be there for this to build up on top of it, and this has to be there before this builds up on top of it. And so you have this layer cake that as you remove that, you're going back further and further in time. And trained archaeologists are able to recognize archaeological stratification, and they build up assemblages as slices of time that represent what's happening with human communities at that moment. That can be a house in this slice of time, or pottery fragments in this slice of time, or stone tools in this slice of time. And on the surface, we've got our mobile phones and our cars and all these things as well. these are the techniques that we use in systematically trying to remove this and record everything as we go along the way. And when I say everything, I mean almost every molecule of dust. That's why it's a slow and very grueling process, because every bit of information can be useful. Little microscopic grains of pollen can tell you about what the environment was like or what the season that this deposit was laid down. Burned, charred seeds can tell you about the diet of people. The soil itself can tell you things about the ancient climate or the date of what you're of how old this deposit is. So everything that you excavate in an archaeological excavation is analyzed and researched, often by subspecialisms that look at these things. So archaeobotanist will be a specialist in looking at ancient plant remains. An archaeozoologist will be a specialist in looking at ancient animal remains. A bioarchaeologist will be a physical anthropologist of ancient remains. Architectural historians or archaeologists, all sorts of things, right? And different methods can be employed to help us to understand the past. So experimental archaeology can try to replicate ancient techniques of doing things, and try and help us to understand a little bit more carefully what we're seeing from the past. Historical archaeologists can use historical written documents to try and supplement and guide their understanding. Also, underwater archaeology can look at things like shipwrecks, but also submerged landscapes. The sea levels have risen and fallen over the years, and also lakes and rivers have covered what was once formerly land. And to get to those deposits, you might need to employ underwater techniques. And then, of course, like I said, cultural resource management deals with threatened archaeology that could be destroyed by development, public works, or road buildings, things like that. Now, how do we know how old things are? This is going to be very important in subsequent chapters when we start dealing with the evolutionary record of humans. Well, we employ scientific methods to try and understand the past. Now, this law of superpositioning that I told you about, the layer cake, that gives us a relative date, that this is the modern surface, so that's later than what's underneath it. But this layer here is later than what's underneath it, and underneath it, and underneath it. That is what we call relative dating.